When most people think of slavery in early America, they imagine a simple and brutal picture: white plantation owners holding black men and women in bondage. But history is never that simple. In fact, one of the most surprising and unsettling truths is that some free black men in colonial America also became slave owners. This little-known chapter of history is both fascinating and deeply ironic, and it begins with the story of a man named Anthony Johnson. Anthony Johnson's life forces us to confront a difficult paradox. Born in Africa, captured by slave traders, and shipped across the Atlantic, he began his life in the New World as an indentured servant. Over time, however, he worked his way to freedom, acquired land, raised a family, and became a respected member of his Virginia community. Yet Johnson did something that still shocks us today. He went to court to claim ownership of another black man, John Kaiser, and won. That ruling made Johnson the first legally recognized slave owner in the American colonies. And yes, he was a black man. Why does this matter? Because Johnson's story forces us to rethink what we think we know about America's past. It challenges the one-dimensional version of slavery often presented in classrooms and media. Instead, it reveals how complex and contradictory human behavior can be when survival, opportunity, and power are at stake. It shows how fragile freedom was in a world where laws, race, and economics were constantly shifting, and it demonstrates that history is never simply about good versus evil, but about people making choices in systems designed to benefit the few and exploit the many. As we explore this story, we will uncover the broader transformation from indentured servitude, where people of all races worked under contracts for a set number of years, into the permanent, hereditary system of slavery that defined America for centuries. Anthony Johnson's case was a turning point, a legal precedent that opened the door to a racialized system of bondage unlike anything the colonies had seen before. This is not just a story about the past. It is a reminder that human beings, when placed in oppressive systems, can sometimes become complicit in perpetuating them. Johnson's legacy is both inspiring and troubling. Inspiring because he overcame impossible odds to build a life of independence. Troubling because he used that independence to deny another man his freedom. If you have ever thought you knew the full story of American slavery, prepare to be surprised. This is the forgotten history of Anthony Johnson, the first recognized slave owner in the colonies. Before we dive deeper into this remarkable and unsettling tale, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss our future explorations into the hidden corners of history. Your support helps us continue to bring you powerful stories that challenge assumptions and shed light on the past. Stay with us, you won't miss what comes next. Some black slave owners inherited enslaved people from their former masters who freed them in their wills. Others entered freedom through hard work or good fortune, and then purchased enslaved workers themselves. And a small number were born free and later rose to positions of wealth and influence. This reality may sound surprising, even contradictory, but it reflects the complexity of the early colonial world where law, religion, opportunity, and survival intersected in ways that rarely fit into a neat moral narrative. When we talk about slavery in the American colonies, it is easy to assume a rigid system that always looked the same, but in truth the early decades were marked by fluid boundaries, contested rights, and people making choices within systems that were still being formed. And into that shifting landscape stepped Anthony Johnson, whose story captures all the contradictions of this strange period. In the early 1600s, the lines between indentured servant and slave were not yet clear. Many Africans who were brought to Virginia were recorded as indentured, much like the Irish or English poor who had sold years of their labor in exchange for passage to the New World. After completing their years of service, some of these men and women were freed, granted land, and even able to build families and fortunes. A society was forming where, For a brief time, skin color did not absolutely dictate destiny. In this narrow window, a person of African descent could sometimes rise, and some did. Yet this freedom also came with harsh realities. To survive in a land where wealth and power depended on labor, some free blacks turned to the same system that had once oppressed them. Acquiring servants or enslaved people to work their land, it was not a choice made in a vacuum. It was a choice framed by the desperate competition of a colony struggling to grow tobacco, pay debts to investors, and defend against both internal unrest and external threats. Anthony Johnson's life sits at the center of this paradox. Captured in Angola, shipped across the Atlantic, and sold into service, he began as property in every sense except legal definition. He endured brutal conditions, survived the Powhatan Uprising of 1622, and, against all odds, managed to complete his term of service and earn his freedom. With his wife Mary, who had also been indentured, he established a family and built a life that seemed almost unimaginable for someone of his background. They purchased land, raised children, and by the 1650s were running a successful farm. In a world where land equaled status, Anthony Johnson was proof that someone of African descent could, at least for a time, reach heights of respect and prosperity. He was even described by courts as a respected community member, a remarkable recognition given the racial prejudices simmering beneath the surface of colonial society. But here is where the story grows more complex. As Johnson expanded his landholdings, he acquired servants to work the tobacco fields, some of them white, others black. Among them was John Kaiser, a man whose fate would forever mark American history. Kaiser claimed his term of service had expired and sought his freedom by moving to work for another man. Johnson, however, sued, insisting that Kaiser was bound to him for life. In the courtroom of Northampton County, a remarkable drama unfolded. A black man stood before a panel of white judges and demanded the right to own another black man as permanent property. Even more remarkable, the court sided with Johnson, ruling that Kaiser would serve him for life. With that decision, Kaiser became the first person in the colonies legally declared a slave for life, and Anthony Johnson became the first recognized slave owner. This outcome forces us to confront the complexity of power in a developing society. Johnson's decision was not simply personal. It was legal precedent. From that moment on, the path to hereditary, race-based slavery widened. Other colonists, seeing the court's ruling, pressed for clearer laws, and within a generation, slavery was no longer a matter of contracts but a permanent condition passed from mother to child. Johnson, who had once been a victim of captivity, now stood as a participant in creating the very system that would eventually strip his own family of rights. It is one of history's deepest ironies. A man who rose above bondage helped pave the way for bondage to become absolute. When we remember that some free blacks also owned enslaved people, inherited them, or purchased them after gaining freedom, we must resist the temptation to judge too simply. Instead, we must understand the world they lived in. To be free in colonial America was to live with constant insecurity, knowing that wealth and survival often depended on exploiting others. In a system built on labor and land, those who could not secure labor were quickly ruined. For men like Johnson, owning servants was not just a symbol of status but a shield against vulnerability. Still, the consequences of these choices would ripple across centuries. By participating in the system, even as exceptions to it, they helped entrench it further. The story of Anthony Johnson and others like him reveals that the history of slavery is not just about black and white, victim and oppressor, but about the gray spaces in between where people made decisions under pressure, sometimes perpetuating injustice even as they sought to escape it. This does not excuse their choices, but it makes their stories more human, and in some ways more tragic. They remind us that history is not a clean line of morality but a tangled web of survival, ambition, fear, and hope. And it is in these tangled stories that we often find the most important lessons. As we continue exploring Johnson's life, remember this: his case was not simply an anomaly, but a turning point. It showed that even those who had endured suffering could perpetuate it, that the boundaries between freedom and slavery were contested in courts and fields long before the system became fixed, and that the seeds of America's racial hierarchy were planted not only by laws from above, but by choices made on the ground. This is why his story still matters today, and why uncovering the forgotten history of men like him helps us understand how deeply woven slavery became into the fabric of America. In the early 17th century, when the Atlantic trade routes were reshaping the destinies of countless lives, one story began far from the shores of England's American colonies. In the lush landscapes of Angola, a young man lived among his people, unaware that his life was about to be torn apart by forces far beyond his control. Conflict swept through his homeland as Portuguese raiding parties and their local allies scoured villages in search of captives to fuel the expanding transatlantic system. In the chaos of violence and displacement, this young man was taken, stripped not only of his freedom but also of the world he had known since birth. He was forced onto a ship, a vessel that carried him away from the familiar soil of Africa into the heart of a brutal system that stretched across oceans. For those who boarded such ships, the journey itself was a crucible of suffering, a voyage that tested the limits of endurance and reshaped identities. When he eventually reached the Americas, he was not the same man who had once walked in Angola's fields. In Virginia, he was registered not by the name he had known in his homeland, but by the name Antonio, a marker that reflected the European tongue of those who had first captured and sold him. The year was 1621, and his arrival placed him at the very beginning of what would become a centuries-long chapter of forced labor and exploitation in North America. For Antonio, this new world was filled with uncertainty, but also with the faint possibility of survival and adaptation in an environment that demanded resilience above all else. Life in Virginia during those years was not yet fully bound by the rigid racial laws that would later come to define the institution. The colony was young, precarious, and still searching for its identity. Europeans, Africans, and indigenous peoples found themselves entangled in a fragile balance where survival often depended on negotiation, adaptation, and the forging of unlikely relationships. Antonio, like others who had endured the passage across the Atlantic, quickly learned that to endure meant to navigate the shifting realities of servitude, labor contracts, and the hierarchies imposed by the colonial elite. Though the conditions were harsh, there remained, at least in those early years, pathways that might lead to something resembling freedom, however fragile or conditional. Antonio's journey reflects more than the forced displacement of one man. It represents the convergence of global systems and personal resilience. He carried with him the memory of Angola, though the world around him sought to erase it. And yet within the limits imposed upon him, he began to carve a place for himself in the colony. It was not easy, and it was never secure, but his life illustrates how individuals caught in the currents of history could still find ways to assert their humanity. Over time, Antonio's story became intertwined with that of others in Virginia. He entered into service, worked the land, and endured the demands of those who held authority over him. But in these years, he also witnessed the shifting definitions of status that blurred lines between servant and slave. In some rare cases, Africans who arrived in these early decades managed to work out their terms of servitude and eventually earn freedom, joining a small but growing community of free people of African descent in the colonies. This was not freedom as understood in a modern sense. It was precarious, vulnerable, and constantly under threat, but it was a space where one could establish a family, acquire land, and begin to weave a life within the colony's fabric. Antonio's very presence in Virginia in 1621 speaks to the early entanglement of Africa and America, of Portugal and England, of violence and survival. Each step he took in this new land was shaped by the legacies of conquest and commerce that had brought him across the sea. And yet, despite being reduced to a name chosen for him, he endured, carrying within himself a story of both loss and persistence. His journey invites us to look closely at how individuals survived these turbulent beginnings, how they navigated systems that sought to strip them of identity, and how, even within such systems, they found ways to assert fragments of control over their lives. This account of Antonio, born in Angola and arriving in Virginia as an enslaved man renamed by those who claimed ownership of him, is more than a footnote in history. It represents the dawn of a chapter that would expand in scale and brutality over the decades, shaping not only the colonies, but also the future of the nation that would grow from them. Yet within that story lies a human being, someone whose life, though overshadowed by the structures of power, still mattered, still carried meaning, and still speaks to us across the centuries. Through him we see the beginnings of a long, painful history, but also the enduring strength of those who bore its weight and continued to live, to resist, and to make their mark on the world, even when everything seemed set against them. When Antonio, the man who would later be known as Anthony Johnson, stepped off the ship that brought him from the coast of Africa to the colony of Virginia, he entered a society still trying to define what it meant to govern, to labor, and to live on the edge of a wilderness. In those early years of the 17th century, Virginia was not yet the Virginia history books would later describe, with clear laws and strict hierarchies. It was instead a fragile settlement clinging to survival, shaped by hunger, disease, and the constant struggle for stability. Antonio, though brought against his will, was not immediately placed in the category that later centuries would rigidly enforce. Instead, he entered into the colony's system of indenture, a kind of contract that bound men and women, whether from England, Ireland, or Africa, to serve for a fixed number of years in exchange for eventual freedom and the possibility of land. For Antonio, the path of indentured servitude was harsh, yet it also left open a narrow but real possibility of eventual independence. He was forced to toil in the tobacco fields, the crop that would come to define Virginia's wealth, under grueling conditions. Yet in those days he labored alongside Europeans who shared similar contracts. Men and women who dreamed of serving their term and then claiming their piece of the new world. This fragile commonality between Africans and Europeans in servitude marked a brief period before laws and customs hardened into the brutal system of permanent racial slavery. At the time of Antonio's arrival in 1621, there was no legislation in Virginia that declared one group destined for perpetual bondage. The system that later generations would take for granted had not yet been written into law. The colony was improvising its labor practices, testing models, and experimenting with forms of hierarchy. In this uncertain landscape, Antonio's identity was not fixed as it would later become under law. He was known as a servant, not yet a slave in the permanent sense. This nuance is often overlooked when we look back with the knowledge of what would come later. It is tempting to see Antonio's journey as inevitably leading to the chains of slavery that would dominate America for centuries. But in truth the 1620s and 1630s were still unsettled years, with blurred lines between freedom and bondage. Some Africans who arrived as servants completed their terms and were granted freedom, land, and even the right to own servants themselves. Antonio's own story would eventually follow this extraordinary path. He endured his contracted years of labor, surviving the harsh realities of the colony where disease and famine cut short many lives, and where disputes between servants and masters were common. Through it all, he maintained his will to endure, and eventually his perseverance allowed him to step out from under servitude and into freedom. It is striking to imagine him, after years of toil, standing as a free man in a land where freedom was rare and precarious. He married Mary, another African who had also completed her time of service, and together they began to build something that seemed almost impossible for people of their background. A household, a farm, and a legacy. They cleared land, planted crops, and raised children. Their lives a testament to resilience in a society that was still undecided on whether men like them could truly belong. For a time, the rules of Virginia allowed them space to rise. They were able to acquire land, and records show that Anthony Johnson came to own hundreds of acres along with servants of his own, placing him in the company of the colony's middling planters. Yet beneath this fragile success, the ground was already shifting. The colony's leaders, eager to secure reliable labor for the booming tobacco economy, were moving toward laws that would distinguish between European indentured servants and African laborers in a permanent way. By the 1640s and 1650s, court cases began to signal a transformation, treating Africans less as temporary servants and more as property whose condition of bondage was to last for life. In 1661, Virginia passed its first law explicitly recognizing slavery as a lifelong condition. And soon after, other laws cemented the status of Africans and their descendants as permanently enslaved. For Anthony Johnson, this change came after he had already achieved freedom and established himself as a landholder. In a paradox that confounds modern understanding, he himself became a figure who defended his rights in court, even asserting ownership over servants in the same system that had once bound him. His life embodied the contradictions of a world that had not yet drawn its harshest lines, a world where Africans could sometimes climb out of servitude into freedom, but where the future was closing in with laws designed to deny such possibilities. Looking back, the fact that Virginia had no slavery laws when Antonio first arrived gives us a glimpse into how different the story of America might have been had the colony chosen a different path. In those early years, there was still room for ambiguity, for possibility, for people of African descent to be recognized as more than labor to be owned. But economic demand, racial prejudice, and the consolidation of colonial power soon hardened those possibilities into barriers. Antonio's transformation into Anthony Johnson, a man who secured freedom and land, stands out as both remarkable and tragic. Remarkable because it was possible in that brief window before slavery became law, and tragic because the world that allowed his rise soon closed forever on those who came after him. His story is therefore not just a personal journey, but a lens through which we can see the shifting contours of a society defining itself. It shows us that the system we now recognize as slavery was not inevitable from the start. It was constructed, piece by piece, through choices made by colonists and lawmakers. Antonio's initial treatment as an indentured servant rather than a permanent slave highlights this moment of contingency, when paths were open that would later be shut. It reminds us that history is not only about what happened, but also about what might have been. His resilience, his survival, and his eventual claim to freedom stand as a testament to human endurance in the face of unimaginable disruption, and as a stark reminder of the fleeting nature of opportunity in a world moving swiftly toward oppression. When Anthony Johnson first arrived in Virginia, the colony was a place of both opportunity and danger, a frontier where survival often depended on luck, resilience, and the ability to earn trust in a world marked by uncertainty. Johnson's early years were not easy. He was bound by an indenture, working the land under the control of a master, expected to endure long hours and punishing conditions in the fields. Yet in those early days, his status was not that of a permanent slave, for Virginia had not yet written slavery into its laws. This meant that while his life was harsh, there was still a path, however narrow, toward freedom and stability if he could survive the years of service. But even this path was uncertain, as the land itself was volatile, and the tensions between the colonists and the native Powhatan people often erupted into sudden violence that tested the endurance of everyone in the colony. It was in this dangerous landscape that Johnson's fate took a remarkable turn. During a Powhatan raid on the settlers, when many others lost their lives, Johnson was among those caught in the chaos. He was wounded in the attack, an injury that could have easily ended his story. Yet he survived, and his survival in itself became something of a mark of distinction. In a place where danger was constant and the mortality rate was high, resilience carried great weight. For his master, seeing Johnson endure the wounds of battle and continue on was more than evidence of physical toughness. It was proof of his reliability, his willpower, and his capacity to endure where others had faltered. In a colony that valued strength and loyalty above nearly everything else, this mattered greatly. Johnson's suffering became the key that elevated his standing in the eyes of his master. The wound, though painful, became a symbol of his integration into the harsh reality of colonial life. He was no longer just an anonymous African laborer recently brought across the ocean. He was a man who had shed blood on the contested soil of Virginia, a man whose life had been bound up with the fortunes of the settlers in a way that demanded acknowledgement. His survival linked him not only to the struggles of the colony, but also to the narrative of perseverance that colonists admired. To his master, Johnson's endurance made him trustworthy, and this trust began to alter the nature of his relationship. Where many indentured servants remained faceless workers with no recognition, Johnson's name and deeds began to carry meaning. This change in perception was crucial, because in Virginia at the time, status was not fixed in the way it would later become. While the colony had not yet formalized lifelong slavery, the conditions for Africans were already far harsher than for many European indentured servants. Yet even within this unequal system, individuals who demonstrated extraordinary resilience or value could sometimes carve out a measure of respect, and Johnson did just that. His reputation grew from his survival, and with that came the possibility of better treatment, the potential for eventual landholding, and the fragile hope of building something lasting. His master, impressed by his loyalty and toughness, began to see him not only as labor, but as someone who could be trusted with greater responsibility. In a society where trust could open doors, this was a turning point. For Johnson, the Powhatan raid was not merely a moment of violence survived. It was the crucible that forged the beginning of his transformation. The wound he bore was both literal and symbolic, a scar that marked the start of his ascent from obscurity toward recognition. The esteem of his master was no small thing, for it meant that when opportunities arose, whether through the granting of land, the loosening of restrictions, or the chance to secure freedom, Johnson would not be overlooked. In a colony built on hierarchy and survival, being noticed in a positive light could mean the difference between a life wasted in endless servitude and a life that offered the faint outline of independence. And so Johnson's story began to shift. He remained bound by his indenture, still laboring under the authority of his master, still enduring hardship that would have broken many others. But now there was something different. The possibility of a future shaped not only by suffering but also by resilience and recognition. He had proven himself in the face of violence and pain, and in doing so, had gained a reputation that few others in his position could claim. This reputation would not only define his relationship with his master, but would also become the foundation upon which his remarkable journey in Virginia would be built. In a land that offered little mercy to those brought from across the ocean, Johnson had managed to find a glimmer of respect, and from that fragile beginning, he would continue to shape a life that defied the odds. When Anthony Johnson first began his life in Virginia, survival was his only concern, but over time his resilience and determination created a path that would carry him toward a future that few in his position could ever have imagined. Among the many turning points in his life, none was as significant or as transformative as the bond he formed with Mary, a woman, like him, had arrived in the colony as an African servant. Their meeting was not the beginning of a simple love story, but rather the start of a partnership that would endure for over 4 decades. Through shifting fortunes and the relentless challenges of life in 17th-century Virginia. To understand the depth of this relationship, it is important to recognize how far Johnson had already come. He had survived a devastating Powhatan raid, carrying wounds that could have claimed his life, and in doing so, he had gained the respect of his master. This hard-won esteem offered him the chance to move beyond the fragile position of a vulnerable servant. But it was his determination to build something lasting with Mary that would truly change the course of his life. The world around them was harsh and uncertain. Disease claimed lives in staggering numbers. Food supplies were often scarce, and the threat of violence hung over both colonists and the indigenous people whose land they occupied. For Africans bound in servitude, these dangers were compounded by the restrictions placed upon their movement and their choices. Yet even within this environment, moments of humanity emerged. In the small gatherings of workers who toiled in the fields, bonds of companionship and trust could form. It was in such a setting that Anthony and Mary came to know one another, not merely as fellow laborers, but as kindred spirits whose shared endurance and quiet strength drew them together. Their courtship did not follow the traditions of the wealthy settlers with their elaborate ceremonies and public displays. Instead, it unfolded quietly, marked by stolen conversations after long days of work and by gestures that communicated care in an environment where comfort was rare. For them, marriage was not simply an act of personal affection, but a declaration of resilience, a way of claiming a measure of humanity and dignity in a society that often sought to deny them both. When they chose to wed, they were carving out a space of belonging for themselves, a place where they could envision a shared future, rather than remain defined solely by the terms of their servitude. Completing their service was no easy feat, and the years of labor required immense physical endurance. But both Anthony and Mary carried within them the resolve to endure until the day of freedom arrived, when at last they secured their release. It was not just the end of servitude, but the beginning of something remarkable, a life lived together as free people. For over 40 years, their marriage endured, weathering not only the personal trials of aging, loss, and the daily struggles of survival, but also the larger shifts of a colony that was constantly changing. The Virginia of their early years was a place where a few Africans could complete service and claim freedom. Yet as decades passed, laws began to shift, hardening the boundaries of race and enslavement. What made their story so extraordinary was that they managed to carve out stability during this turbulent period. On their land, which they would eventually come to own, Anthony and Mary cultivated not only crops but also the idea of permanence. They raised children, nurtured family bonds, and built a household that stood as a testament to what determination and unity could accomplish. In an era when African lives were often reduced to labor and survival, their family represented continuity, memory, and the possibility of legacy. The endurance of their partnership carried deeper meaning than mere longevity. Every year they lived together as free individuals stood as a quiet act of defiance against the expectations of the society around them. For many colonists, African men and women were seen as temporary laborers, their presence tied to contracts or the whims of masters. By contrast, Anthony and Mary built a life that endured across generations, a home that stood as proof that freedom could be more than a fleeting condition, it could be a foundation. The bond they shared also reveals something vital about the human spirit in times of adversity. In their companionship, Anthony and Mary found strength to confront not only external hardships, but also the emotional weight of their past. Their love was not untouched by the scars of servitude, but rather shaped by them, making every day of freedom more valuable. Together they transformed survival into something more enduring, a life filled with purpose, family, and hope. Over the course of 4 decades, they bore witness to a world that grew more hostile to free Africans. Yet their household remained a symbol of resilience. By the time their children were grown and their legacy began to take root, Anthony and Mary had accomplished what once might have seemed impossible. They had turned the fragile gift of freedom into a life that spanned generations, creating a story that continues to resonate because it speaks to the universal desire for love, stability, and dignity in the face of overwhelming odds. In remembering their journey, it becomes clear that their marriage was not just a personal union but a historical marker, a reminder of what could be achieved even in the most restrictive of times. Their 40-plus years together remind us that history is not only shaped by wars, leaders, or grand events, but also by the endurance of individuals who, through resilience and devotion, redefine what is possible. Anthony and Mary Johnson's story continues to stand as a testament to the strength of human connection and to the extraordinary power of a shared life built on faith in one another and the hope for a better tomorrow. By 1651, the arc of Anthony Johnson's life had become something almost unimaginable when compared to the way it had begun, for he had arrived in Virginia decades earlier as a servant with nothing but the will to survive. And now he stood as the master of a sprawling 250-acre tract of land, secured under the colony's headright system, which rewarded those who could bring laborers into the colony with land of their own. For Johnson, this was more than just soil and boundaries. It was the promise of permanence in a land where permanence was often denied. And it was the proof that a man who had once been unfree could, through perseverance and shrewd navigation of opportunity, carve out a position of influence in the harsh new world of the Virginia colony. Tobacco was the lifeblood of the colony, the crop that turned marshy riverbanks and forest clearings into fields of wealth. And Johnson was no mere smallholder scratching at the dirt. He was running a plantation that demanded organization, foresight, and a relentless commitment to the rhythm of planting, tending, and harvesting, all while overseeing the servants whose labor transformed the land into profit. It is easy to imagine him walking through his fields at dawn, the rows stretching out before him in neat lines, the humid air heavy with the scent of earth and leaves, while servants bent to their work under the rising sun. Each acre represented not only wealth but survival, for the colony itself was often precarious, and fortunes rose and fell as quickly as the weather changed or the price of tobacco shifted across the Atlantic. Yet Johnson, with his sharp mind and hard-earned resilience, managed to thrive. His plantation was not just a patch of land but a statement, a declaration that he belonged in this place that had once tried to confine him, and that he could build not only a livelihood but a legacy for his family. His marriage to Mary, another African servant who had earned her freedom, had already shown his commitment to stability and endurance, and together they had weathered decades of change in Virginia, raising children and shaping a household that became a rare example of continuity in a world that often fractured families apart. By securing 250 acres, Johnson also demonstrated his ability to play by the very rules designed by colonial authorities to reward those who reinforced the system. The headright system was intended to populate the colony with labor and ensure the success of tobacco exports. But for Johnson, it provided a loophole into prosperity. Every laborer he could bring over, whether through financing their passage or aligning with others, translated into more acres. And with more acres came greater status. This was not merely about wealth. It was about being recognized within the legal framework of the colony. For landownership meant the right to vote in local matters, the right to defend one's property in court, and the right to be treated, at least on paper, as a man with authority and rights. In the rigidly hierarchical world of 17th century Virginia, these were no small victories. The land itself became a kind of shield, insulating Johnson and his family from the instability that so often plagued freed servants. Many who gained their freedom found themselves landless, drifting from place to place in search of employment, trapped in a cycle of poverty that left them vulnerable to exploitation. Johnson, by contrast, had transformed himself into a landholder who could employ others and in doing so he reversed the power dynamic that had once defined his own life. There is a kind of irony in this, but also a testament to the complexity of survival in early America. He had once labored under the authority of another man, and now others labored under his. His plantation required tobacco barns for curing leaves, fences to keep out wandering livestock, and the steady flow of tools, barrels, and supplies, all of which placed him squarely in the network of Virginia's economic engine. Neighbors would have known his name, for even if prejudice ran deep and the social order sought to place men like him at the margins, land spoke louder than prejudice in many practical matters. With acres under his control, Johnson was part of the colonial fabric, attending to disputes, paying taxes, and managing affairs that tied him to the same system as his English-born counterparts. The resilience it must have taken to claim this position cannot be overstated. For every acre tilled and every harvest packed into casks for export across the ocean, there was also the memory of a past that could not be erased, a reminder of how far he had traveled both physically and socially. In telling his story, one begins to see the contradictions of early colonial society. On the one hand, Johnson's success illustrates that the system, at least for a time, allowed a man of African descent to secure land and autonomy, something that would become increasingly rare as racial boundaries hardened in the decades ahead. On the other hand, his reliance on the same structures of servitude and labor reveals how survival often meant participating in a cycle that echoed the very hardships he had once endured. This complexity makes his story both remarkable and unsettling, for it shows that freedom in 17th-century Virginia was never simple, never guaranteed, and always contingent on one's ability to adapt to shifting laws, economic demands, and social expectations. By 1651, then, Anthony Johnson had done more than just amass land. He had carved out a place in history as a man who defied the odds, building a plantation that stood as both a beacon of his determination and a reminder of the tenuous nature of opportunity in colonial America. His fields of tobacco, his household sustained by decades of perseverance, and his legal recognition as a landholder all spoke to a legacy that would endure long after the tobacco leaves of that year had been cured and shipped away. In the rhythm of the seasons and the labor of those who worked his land, Johnson had woven himself into the story of Virginia, a story that reflected both the promise and the paradox of a colony still defining itself at the edge of empire. In the decades that followed Anthony Johnson's rise as a landowner, Virginia was undergoing a profound transformation that would alter not only the colony's future, but also the destiny of countless generations. The tobacco boom had created immense wealth for those who controlled land and labor. But the question of who could truly belong within this new society remained unsettled. For a time, religion had been seen as a potential pathway to freedom. Christian baptism was once thought to offer some level of protection for Africans, suggesting that conversion might place them outside the bonds of lifelong servitude. But as the colony grew wealthier and more dependent on tobacco, economic interests began to eclipse earlier ideas about equality under God. Planters and lawmakers saw an opportunity to solidify their control by ensuring that status and labor would be passed down through generations without challenge. It was in this climate of shifting priorities and growing anxieties about labor that a critical decision was made in 1662, one that would have consequences far beyond the boundaries of Virginia. That year, the Virginia Assembly declared that the condition of a child would follow that of the mother, a principle drawn from Roman law but now applied with devastating permanence in the English colonies. In practice, this meant that if an African woman was held in servitude, her children would inherit the same condition at birth, regardless of the identity or status of their father. No baptism, no conversion, no promise of religious redemption could alter this outcome. Christianity, once imagined as a shield, was stripped of its power to offer protection. By tying a person's fate to the status of their mother, Virginia lawmakers created a self-perpetuating system that ensured the continuation of hereditary servitude for Africans and their descendants. The implications were staggering. Until then, there had been a fluid, uncertain line between indentured servitude and bondage for life, with occasional possibilities for Africans to gain freedom, own land, and even employ servants themselves, as Anthony Johnson once had. But the law of 1662 shifted the balance irreversibly. Children who might once have been seen as freeborn because of baptism, or because of a father of English descent, were now bound by the condition of their mothers, sealing them into a life from which there would be no escape. The door that had briefly opened for African families in the early decades of Virginia was now slammed shut. This law was not just about control. It was about shaping the colony's social fabric. By ensuring that status passed through the mother, Virginia's leaders established a legal framework that stripped African families of hope for generational progress. It made the boundaries of society brutally clear, dividing those who could dream of property and inheritance from those who would be perpetually denied. In doing, it entrenched a racial hierarchy that would only grow more rigid with each passing decade. Even as Christian churches spread across the colony, the law ensured that faith could not challenge the economic interests of the planters. Salvation was promised for the soul, but the body remained bound to the fields. Stories from the time reflect how deeply this new reality cut into the lives of African families. A woman who labored in the tobacco fields knew that her children would share her fate, regardless of the father's status or her own devotion to Christianity. For families, this created a cruel paradox. Their lives could be filled with faith and hard work, yet their children would never be free to choose their path. The very idea of legacy, so central to English settlers who measured success in land and inheritance, was turned into something starkly different for Africans in Virginia, a legacy of labor imposed at birth, stretching endlessly forward. The 1662 law also reveals how fear and greed often walk hand in hand. Planters feared losing control of their labor force, worried that conversion or mixed parentage might undermine their claims. At the same time, they saw immense financial gain in guaranteeing that future generations would remain tied to their estates. By writing this principle into law, they secured not only their immediate harvests but also the descendants' prosperity. Each child born to an African woman in Virginia was no longer seen first as a human being, but as labor calculated into the colony's future. Anthony Johnson's story, so remarkable in the early 1600s, stands in painful contrast to this new legal order. His family, once landowners who had carved out a measure of independence in a harsh world, would eventually find their claim to land contested and their rights undermined. What was possible for one generation became increasingly unthinkable for the next. Johnson's rise had represented a fleeting moment when Africans could find space within the colony's evolving society. But the law of 1662 marked the beginning of a system designed to ensure that such a story would not be repeated. The voices of those who lived under this law rarely appear in the official records, but their silence speaks volumes. Every child born under its shadow carried the weight of decisions made not by their families, but by a colonial assembly that placed economic security above human dignity. In that silence lies a haunting reminder of how laws, once written, can shape lives for centuries. The Virginia Assembly may not have fully grasped the enormity of what they had set in motion, but the legacy of 1662 would ripple outward, shaping not only the future of the colony but also the trajectory of an entire nation. The law tied identity, status, and opportunity directly to race in a way that was deliberate and enduring. It transformed servitude from a temporary condition into a lifelong, inherited one, institutionalizing inequality in a manner that could not be undone by baptism, personal merit, or even paternal lineage. What began as a decision to secure a labor force for tobacco fields became one of the earliest building blocks of a system that would define America for centuries to come. And in this moment, the fragile hope of freedom that once glimmered for Africans in Virginia grew dim, as the future hardened into something far more unforgiving. In the mid-17th century, when the colonies of North America were still shaping their laws and customs, one legal battle would alter the course of history in ways that few could have imagined at the time. It began not in the grand halls of power, but on the fertile lands of Virginia, where a man named Anthony Johnson, himself of African origin and once bound as a servant, sought to establish his authority in a society that was still fluid in its social boundaries. Johnson had worked his way to relative prosperity, acquiring land, servants, and recognition as a free man. His story might have stood as an early example of resilience and opportunity, but it took a dramatic turn when he entered into conflict over the fate of a man named John Kaiser, who had labored under his authority. Kaiser was originally bound as an indentured servant, expected to serve a finite term before gaining his freedom, much like many others who crossed the Atlantic under similar contracts. Indentured servitude was a common arrangement in the early colonies, not limited to any one ethnicity, and thousands of Europeans also worked under such terms, with the expectation of eventual release and a chance to build a life of their own. Yet in Johnson's claim against Kaiser, something different unfolded. Johnson asserted that Kaiser was not simply a temporary servant but a laborer bound to him for life, a claim that would not only test the limits of the law, but also expose the shifting attitudes toward race and servitude in the colonies. When the dispute reached the courts in 1655, it was more than a personal quarrel between two men. It was a moment that revealed the direction colonial society was beginning to take. Kaiser had sought refuge under the protection of another free landowner, believing that his term of service had been fulfilled. Johnson, however, brought legal action, insisting that Kaiser was his servant for life and demanding his return. The court faced a decision that would reverberate far beyond the individuals standing before them. At the time, the lines between indentured servitude and perpetual bondage were not yet firmly drawn, and precedents were still in the making. What happened in this courtroom would lay one of the first stones in the foundation of a system that endured for centuries. The court's ruling was stark and unprecedented. They sided with Johnson, declaring that John Kaiser was indeed bound to him for life. With that decision, Kaiser became the first person in the English colonies legally recognized as a slave for life, rather than an indentured servant with an eventual path to freedom. This was not just a judgment about one man's fate. It was a signal that the law could and would sanction permanent, hereditary bondage. What had previously been a labor system with eventual release for most now took a step toward racialized slavery, in which freedom would no longer be guaranteed, and the condition of servitude could extend indefinitely. The case of Johnson and Kaiser is one of history's paradoxes. Johnson himself was of African descent, once an indentured servant brought to Virginia. He had earned his freedom, gained land, and integrated into the colonial fabric, even managing to thrive in a world that was not yet rigidly divided along racial lines. Yet in pressing his claim against Kaiser, Johnson helped create a legal precedent that would later be used against countless men, women, and children of African descent. The irony is striking. A man who had risen from servitude fought to ensure another remained bound for life, and in doing so, unwittingly contributed to the legal framework that would one day strip away opportunities for others like himself. This moment reveals how the early colonies were moving toward codifying difference. The decision against Kaiser came at a time when laws were being quietly adjusted, shifting the status of Africans in the colonies from servants to permanent laborers, distinct from their European counterparts. Only a few decades later, statutes would declare that children inherited the status of their mothers, effectively locking entire generations into bondage regardless of conversion, baptism, or personal merit. The Johnson-Kaiser case stands at the beginning of this transformation. a pivot from fluid boundaries toward the hardened racial divisions that came to define the institution of slavery in North America. The human element of this story should not be overlooked. For John Kaiser, this ruling meant the erasure of hope for independence. Whatever dreams he might have carried of farming his own land or living as a free man were extinguished in a courtroom where his voice was powerless against the authority of those who claimed ownership over his life. His story, though less known, represents the countless others whose aspirations were cut short by the tightening grip of a system that valued labor above liberty. For Johnson, the case secured his claim, but his legacy is shadowed by the consequences of that victory. He may have gained possession of Kaiser's lifetime service, but in doing so, he played a role in shaping a system that would later deny opportunities to people of his own heritage. The irony of his triumph foreshadows the harsh reality that success for a few could be built on the suffering of many, and that the survival of one man's fortune could contribute to the entrenchment of an institution that denied humanity to others. Looking back, the Johnson-Kaiser case is not merely a footnote in colonial history. It is a turning point that shows how personal disputes could crystallize into precedent, and how the actions of individuals could ripple into vast systems of law and control. It is a reminder of how fragile the boundaries of freedom were in a society still deciding its values, and how quickly opportunity could be narrowed into oppression when economic interests demanded it. This early case of lifelong bondage set the tone for what was to come, shaping the destiny of generations and altering the very identity of the colonies that would one day become the United States. In the tangled history of early America, few stories carry the same weight of irony and complexity as that of Anthony Johnson, a man whose life journey took him from bondage to freedom, and then into the role of a landowner who would challenge the very boundaries of liberty in the colonies. Johnson, originally brought to Virginia from Angola, arrived in the New World under the condition of servitude, a system that at the time often promised eventual release after a fixed number of years. Like many who endured this harsh arrangement, he struggled against the odds, endured years of labor, and finally gained his freedom. His perseverance allowed him to rise above his circumstances and build a life that few of his peers ever attained. Securing land, marrying, and raising a family in a world where free men of African descent were a rarity. Yet the most striking and paradoxical chapter of his life unfolded not through his struggles for freedom, but in the choices he made once he had achieved it. Johnson's rise in Virginia society was a remarkable accomplishment. By the 1640s, he had acquired land and was recognized as a successful farmer, standing alongside his English neighbors as an equal in the pursuit of prosperity. His farm was a rare example of what resilience and determination could achieve in a colony where opportunities for people of African descent were extremely limited. He lived not as an outsider, but as part of the growing community of landowners who helped shape the early economic fabric of Virginia. It was in this environment that Johnson entered into a dispute that would forever link his name to one of the earliest legal precedents of perpetual servitude in America. At the center of the conflict was John Kaiser, a man who had come to Johnson's household as an indentured servant. Like others bound under indenture, Kaiser expected that his labor would eventually come to an end, and that he would be free to build a life of his own. But Johnson viewed the situation differently. In his, Kaiser was not a temporary servant, but someone who belonged to him permanently, with no promise of eventual release. This disagreement escalated into a legal battle, one that reached the colonial courts and forced Virginia's legal system to confront the ambiguous line between servitude and slavery. When Johnson sued to retain Kaiser as his servant for life, the court delivered a ruling that would reverberate far beyond their small community. In 1655, the Virginia court sided with Johnson, declaring that Kaiser would remain bound to him permanently. This was not simply another dispute between two men over labor. It was the first recorded legal recognition of lifelong slavery in the English colonies. The decision marked a turning point, one that transformed the temporary system of indenture into something far darker and enduring. From that moment on, the possibility of bondage lasting for an entire lifetime became not only possible but enforceable by law. The irony of the case lay in Johnson himself. He was not only a freed African man, but also the one who successfully argued for the permanent enslavement of another. His status as the first recognized legal slave owner in the American colonies defied the expectations of history, creating a narrative filled with contradictions. On one hand, his life embodied the triumph of perseverance. A man who had endured the brutal conditions of servitude and managed to secure freedom, prosperity, and recognition. On the other, his decision to fight for ownership of another man's life bound him to the origins of a system that would expand into one of the darkest chapters of American history. Johnson's case reveals how the early colonies were still in the process of defining their social and legal boundaries. At that time, freedom and servitude were not yet clearly divided along rigid lines of race. Europeans and Africans alike could be indentured, and freedom could be earned through years of labor. But Johnson's victory in court shifted that dynamic. By proving that one man could be declared a slave for life, the decision laid a foundation for laws that would later strip away the rights of Africans and their descendants, creating a hereditary system of bondage. It was the beginning of a transformation from temporary servitude to racialized slavery, one that would dominate the American landscape for centuries. The story of Anthony Johnson stands as both an extraordinary personal journey and a cautionary tale. He was a man who overcame immense obstacles, defied expectations, and carved out a place of success in a society that gave little room for advancement. Yet he also made choices that connected him directly to the legal birth of lifelong bondage in the colonies. His legacy is therefore neither simple nor one-dimensional. It is instead a reminder of how the pursuit of survival, power, and prosperity in the harsh realities of colonial life could lead individuals down paths filled with contradictions. By understanding Johnson's role in this turning point, we see how history is shaped not only by sweeping forces and broad movements, but also by individual decisions that ripple outward. His victory in court was not just about one man and one servant. It became part of the architecture of a system that would expand to define generations. And within that story lies the complex truth of early America, a place where freedom and bondage coexisted uneasily, and where the choices of one man could set precedents that altered the lives of countless others. Johnson's journey reminds us that history is rarely straightforward. It is filled with paradoxes, moments of triumph shadowed by choices that carry unintended consequences. His life embodied both the possibilities and the perils of the New World, where a man could rise from servitude to land ownership, yet also help establish the legal framework of slavery itself. In the story of Anthony Johnson, we encounter the deep contradictions at the heart of America's beginnings, contradictions that would echo through centuries to come. When Anthony Johnson passed away in 1670, the story of his life did not end with the quiet closing of his eyes or the inheritance of his land by his children. Instead, what unfolded was a striking reflection of the fragile nature of freedom and ownership for people of African descent in early America. Johnson had once been an indentured servant himself, arriving in Virginia in chains but earning his release through years of labor, eventually building a life of prosperity. He defied the odds, amassing land, raising a family, and even employing workers of his own, both African and European, in a colony where survival itself was a struggle. His success stood out as remarkable, and for a brief moment it seemed to suggest that opportunity was not entirely closed off to those who began their lives in servitude. Yet the reality of the social order in the colonies was far less forgiving, and Anthony Johnson's death revealed just how precarious his accomplishments truly were. When Johnson died, his heirs expected to inherit his estate like any other family in Virginia. The land he had cultivated, the property he had earned, and the recognition he had fought for over decades should have been passed down as a rightful legacy. But the colony had already begun reshaping itself into a rigid society where race became the central dividing line. Despite Johnson's wealth, his decades of residence, and his contributions to the community, his neighbors and colonial authorities did not regard him as an equal landowner. Instead, they ruled that because he was a Negro and alien, he had no true claim to property. And neither did his children. In a single judgment, years of labor and achievement were erased. His estate seized by white neighbors who simply absorbed what he had built into their holdings. This moment is often overshadowed in the larger narrative of American slavery. Yet it provides one of the clearest windows into how the colonies transitioned from a system of indentured servitude, where Africans and Europeans sometimes shared similar conditions, into a racialized system of hereditary bondage. Johnson's life had represented the possibility of something different, that an African man could rise to prominence, own land, and even achieve a measure of respect within colonial society. But his death marked the undoing of that possibility. The legal stripping of his heirs' rights sent a chilling message that success for people like Johnson was not only fragile, but ultimately impermanent in the face of laws and attitudes designed to exclude them. It is important to pause here and consider the irony. Johnson had once fought in court to claim John Kaiser as his servant for life, an action that many historians mark as one of the earliest formal acknowledgments of slavery in the colonies. Johnson, in securing Kaiser's permanent servitude, inadvertently played a role in shaping the very system that would later deny his own children the right to inherit their father's estate. The complexity of this history reminds us that individuals acted within the boundaries of their times, sometimes in ways that perpetuated the injustices they themselves faced. Johnson's victory in the Kaiser case cemented his reputation as a man of influence. Yet it also contributed to the legal precedents that hardened slavery into an institution defined by race. By the time of Johnson's death, Virginia was already codifying laws that drew sharper distinctions between Europeans and Africans. The courts and assemblies began to link blackness with perpetual servitude and exclusion, creating a system where freedom for people of African descent became increasingly rare. The ruling that stripped Johnson's heirs of their rights was not an isolated act, but part of this broader transformation. His land did not simply pass into other hands because of individual prejudice. It was taken because the colony itself was being reshaped into a society where race determined not only one's labor but one's humanity. Property and legacy. The human cost of this decision is difficult to overstate. For Johnson's children, it was the sudden loss of their inheritance, the erasure of their father's decades of struggle, and the stark realization that their bloodline would not be allowed the security enjoyed by their neighbors. For the broader community, it was a signal that no matter how industrious or successful a black family might be, the colonial system would find ways to deny them permanence. What Johnson had built in life was undone in death, and this erasure served as a warning to others who might hope to follow his path. And yet, Johnson's story remains vital precisely because it captures this turning point. His rise from servant to landowner showed what was possible in the early, more fluid years of the colonies. His death and the loss of his estate revealed how quickly that fluidity was closed off by laws and prejudices that hardened into systemic slavery. It is a narrative of both hope and betrayal, a testament to the resilience of one man and a reflection of the structures that sought to erase that resilience. Looking back, Johnson's life is not just the tale of an individual but a mirror of America's beginnings. Filled with contradictions, he was a man who rose from bondage to wealth, who embraced the legal system to secure his own advantage, and who, in the end, was denied by that same system. His legacy is both inspiring and sobering, showing the possibilities of human determination and the cruel limitations imposed by racial hierarchies. The fact that his heirs were dispossessed underscores how deeply the colonies had turned toward institutionalized racial slavery by the late 17th century. In telling his story, we are reminded that the path of history is not inevitable but shaped by choices, struggles, and contradictions. Johnson's life and death illustrate the fragility of freedom when systems of exclusion take root, and his family's dispossession serves as an early chapter in the long history of African Americans being denied the fruits of their labor. It is not simply a tale of one man losing his land. It is the broader story of a society deciding who could belong and who could not. That choice, made in courtrooms and fields across Virginia, would reverberate for centuries, shaping the contours of American life long after Johnson's name faded from memory. Johnson's story does not end with his death, nor with the unjust confiscation of his land. In fact, it continues to echo through the centuries, not only as the personal journey of one man, but as a mirror of a nation in the making. The arc of his life captures a moment of possibility, a time when lines of race were blurred, when a black man could gain freedom, own land, and even employ white servants, yet it also exposes the moment when those possibilities began to close, replaced by laws and customs that hardened into systems of racial bondage. In this way, Anthony Johnson became both a paradox and a pivotal figure in the history of America. What makes his life so striking is the way it embodies transition. In the early years of the colonies, society was harsh but fluid. People came as indentured servants, bound by contracts but eventually freed to chase their fortunes. Land was plentiful, labor was scarce, and opportunity, while uneven, was not yet strictly defined by color. Anthony Johnson's rise from servitude to landowner is proof of that fluidity. His marriage, his children, his farm, and even his victory in court against a white neighbor all show a world that had not yet hardened into absolute racial hierarchies. But with his death in 1670, the tide turned. The very success that Johnson had fought for became a target. When the courts declared him an alien and used his African origin as the justification to strip his heirs of their inheritance, it was more than just a legal ruling against one family. It was a declaration of a new order. From then on, race would define destiny in ways that contracts and personal effort could no longer overturn. The path toward hereditary, race-based slavery had been set, and Johnson's story became a dividing line between two eras. In the centuries that followed, millions of men, women, and children would be born into a system that denied them freedom from the moment they took their first breath. Unlike Johnson, they would never be given the chance to work off a contract, to marry freely, to claim land, or to defend themselves in court. His unusual life became less of a model and more of an exception, a brief glimpse of what might have been, before history took a darker turn. And yet, his legacy is not only one of tragedy, it is also one of resilience. Johnson's rise from the fields of servitude to the independence of landownership is a reminder of human determination, of the will to survive and to thrive despite overwhelming odds. Even though his heirs were denied the fruits of his labor, the memory of his success lingers as a testament to possibility. He showed that freedom could be claimed, however briefly, and that dignity could be carved out of a world designed to deny it. When we look back on his life today, we are confronted with the complexities of America's past. Johnson forces us to grapple with contradictions. A black man who held white servants, a freedman who became wealthy, and yet a father whose children lost everything to racial prejudice. His life reveals both the hope and the cruelty embedded in the nation's foundation. It invites us to question what freedom means, who it belongs to, and how fragile it can be when society decides to limit it by law or by custom. In telling Anthony Johnson's story, we are not only recounting the life of one man, we are reflecting on the birth of a system that shaped centuries of history. His journey helps us understand how opportunity was narrowed, how injustice was codified, and how race became central to the structure of American society. He stands as both a warning and a lesson, that the rights of one person, if stripped away, foreshadow the struggles of many. And so, as we close this story, Let us carry forward what Johnson's life teaches us: that freedom is never guaranteed, that justice must be protected, and that history's turning points often lie in the stories of individuals whose names risk being forgotten. Remembering Anthony Johnson is not just about honoring the past. It is about recognizing how its shadows continue to shape the present. Thank you for joining me on this journey through time, for listening closely to a story that deserves to be remembered. If you found meaning in this exploration, I invite you to support this channel, like this video, subscribe for more stories that bring history to life, and share it with others who might reflect on these lessons with us. Together, we can keep history alive, not as dusty, but as living narratives that help us see who we are and who we might become. And now, as the night falls and we part ways, I wish you rest and peace. May your evening be calm, your dreams gentle, and your heart a little fuller from the stories of the past. Sleep well, and good night.